Wait, 100?
Hello, my wonderful friends, and welcome to another collection of mini eShop reviews. I know, me, actually playing games. I couldn't believe it either, and yet, here we are. As usual, I will remind you that I'm calling these reviews even though they don't fit the exact same criteria. If I'm not enjoying a game enough, I won't finish it, but I'll still want to tell you what I thought about it. And because of this, it wouldn't necessarily be fair to give a game like that a score. So some of these are reviews, some are more like review impressions, what have you. Now, with the obligatory disclaimer complete, let's review some video games on the Switch eShop. Not sure what's happening to this intro. I played The Room a few years ago on PC, but I enjoyed it so much that when Team 17 sent me a Switch code, I couldn't help but give it another go. The game is sort of a mix between a point-and-click adventure and an escape room. The entire thing centers around this strange device left to you by someone who is investigating some sort of strange paranormal phenomenon. This device is covered in puzzles and keys and secret compartments and such, and you slowly unlock it more and more as you go. You get little snippets of story here and there, and I must say, the mystery is a rather compelling one. Between that mystery and the general video gamey desire to accomplish a task, unlocking each layer is quite the thrill. The whole game is right there in front of you, and it's nice to constantly work toward this one central goal. As with the PC version, the graphics are simply phenomenal, and the game runs terrifically. Everything is rendered realistically and with exquisite detail, with special attention given to the texturing and lighting. Graphics aren't everything, but when you're focused on one single thing throughout the entire course of a game, pleasant visuals aid dramatically in lifting up the entire experience. Also lifting up the experience are the game's optional gyro controls. You've probably heard me complain about this before, but I feel that more games should employ these kinds of controls, especially ones that require heavy use of a cursor. As always, the cursor here can drift and slowly lose calibration, but that's the case with any game, and it's easy enough to center again. And the result is the next best thing to traditional mouse or touch controls. Once you practice with it a bit, you'll find yourself easily rotating the camera and interacting with all of the device's little bits and doodads. The Room is a fairly short game, but I'd say that considering the style, really it's just the right length. Any longer, and I think it might start to overstay its welcome. Overall, it's a very enjoyable experience while it lasts, and if I have one major complaint, it's that none of the sequels are on Switch yet. They're all mobile games, and I do not have a phone that can handle that kind of thing. If they decide to port any of them to the Switch someday, I'll be sure to snatch them up faster than you can say, "Oh, hi, Mark." I'm a little late to the party when it comes to reviewing Axial Verge, I know. It was a pretty high-profile game upon release, and the announcement of its sequel even got a special place in one of Nintendo's indie showcases. I try not to get my hopes up too high when going into a game. It is a very deliberate goal of mine to judge a game based on what it is and not necessarily what I was expecting. But I must say that despite this, in this particular case, I think I expected more from Axial Verge. I had heard so much buzz surrounding it that I was kind of hoping for it to be one of those modern classics. Alas, for me at least, it didn't quite hit that mark. Don't get me wrong though, it's a solid game. It's a Metroidvania, and one of those very pure ones that emulate Super Metroid in many ways. First and foremost, you've got your sci-fi theme and your pixel graphics. The art is very lovely, and the world is this bizarre, hellish alien landscape that I must say I did enjoy exploring a great deal. The game very cleverly twists on Samus's morph ball concept by giving you a little robot that can fit through little holes. You control it remotely, and you can even upgrade its abilities so it functions the same as a morph ball without being an exact copy of the ability. Exploring the game's roots even further, you acquire these glitchy kind of abilities that let you manipulate the world, which is a very clever nod to Super Metroid glitching and speedrunning. The controls are pretty good, everything feels nice and tight, but the game only allows you to aim at set angles, like the games of yore, which does have its own advantages, but also makes the combat feel frustratingly stilted at times. It's a little difficult for me to play a modern game with two control sticks available to me and not be able to hit something without adjusting my position instead of just, aiming and firing. In fact, archaic elements are ultimately what bring this game down. Sometimes there is one single thing you need to do in order to progress, but you don't know where on this big giant map it might be. Yes, this is a very common issue with the genre as a whole, and therefore might sound like a nitpick, but I would say it happened to me more often than with most games of this type, and it's an issue that plenty of games have learned to address. Then there's another issue that's common in the genre, though I am even less forgiving of it. There is something of a fast travel system, but it often feels lacking. It's that thing where you know you need to get to a certain area and you spend a ton of time examining the map and working your way there, only to find that there's a dead end and you need to go around. I spent way too much time in this game needlessly backtracking, either hunting for a way forward or simply trying to get somewhere I had already been just to see if there was anything there that I missed. Again, many Metroidvanias do this, but it feels like a needless issue to me. It would not be difficult to design a few more shortcuts to open up as you move through the game and earn the right to use them. Back to the good stuff though, the creature design is very good, sometimes even fantastic. Some of the bosses are very large and the camera pans way out to show them, making for some very interesting large-scale fights. The music is also predictably good, with one or two of the tunes sticking with me a good while after I finished the game. All in all, it nails the tone it's going for perfectly, and I really appreciate it for that. I'm very into this kind of weird sci-fi. There is a lot of lore to dig into, though unfortunately I found that I was not smart enough to take most of it in. I never really figured out what was going on, and by the end I was pretty lost. But I hesitate to blame the game for that, lest I should expose my ineptitude to anyone who understood the story perfectly. All in all, I really did enjoy Axial Verge, at least enough to give the sequel a try when it comes around, but I only enjoyed it as much as any decent Metroidvania. It didn't really grip me like I expected, and its archaic elements brought it down a good few notches. At times, the game feels like it has the potential to expand upon the genre and deliver something really special, but it's happy kinda just doing the same old thing those old games did first. And hey, if that's what the developer wanted to do, I guess that was his right. But I do have high hopes for the sequel. If he makes some tweaks and refines the formula a bit, he could have something really cool on his hands. Earthworms is a point-and-click adventure game, and boy howdy do I love me a good point-and-click adventure game. It's hard to go into too much detail without spoiling things, but I'll say that you play as a detective investigating some very strange paranormal occurrences. This detective has some paranormal powers himself and has these weird visions that aid him in his investigation. The game is an interesting mishmash of things. It often plays out like a comedy, especially with the character's own quirky commentary, but then there are elements of horror and you explore some very surreal stuff by the end. The art is all hand-drawn, and it's got this kind of squishy, organic quality to it that makes for a fairly unnerving experience. It's kind of hard to explain, actually, especially when you get into what the game is really about. Some of the visuals have this nauseating kind of quality. That sounds like a bad thing, I know, but I assure you it's all very effective and adds wonderfully to the horror element. The story is very interesting, though I must admit that when it started pushing very hard into the surreal angle, that was when I started kind of losing track of what was going on. What can I say? Not understanding stories is apparently my thing. The ending was disappointingly abrupt, and when I looked it up, I found that there were other possible endings, but I would have to play through the whole game again to get one of them, and frankly, I'm just not interested in doing that. I mean, you gotta pick up like one single item that you missed and play through the entire game again just to get the ending. Based on that, never really been my thing. Earthworms, as with just about every other point-and-click adventure in existence, does suffer from some common pitfalls. There were a good few times when there was one teeny little thing I wasn't noticing and I had no idea how to progress. In those situations, you're forced to either look up a guide or walk around all over the place clicking on everything possible until you find what you need. Then, of course, point-and-click games on consoles present their own kinds of problems when you're using a controller. Overall, the game has a few UI and quality of life issues. So obviously, it's not a perfect experience, but I can easily say that I enjoyed my time with it. I got it on sale for like $1 or something, so I certainly can't complain. Even if I paid full price, I would have still walked away from it satisfied. If you're into point-and-click adventure games and semi-horrific surrealism, you will probably have a great time with it. When I first saw screenshots of Figment, I assumed it was one of those very pretty, quirky point-and-click adventure games. Wow, I've used that term a lot in this video, haven't I? Weird. Anyway, that's just the kind of vibe its art gives off. But when I finally played the game, I realized that it wasn't a point and click at all, though after completing it, I feel like maybe it should have been. The art is incredibly beautiful. It's got that wonderful style that I've been seeing in recent years where it's hard to find the line between a 2D object and a 3D one. Many of the 3D objects are rendered in just such a way that they blend in perfectly with the pre-rendered elements. The result is a marvelous, cohesive style that is always a joy to behold. The set design is also phenomenal. The game takes place inside someone's mind, and the environment is a mishmash of common household objects and areas and landmarks representing major cognitive functions. The entire idea of moving through a person's mind and seeing what state it's currently in and fighting enemies that represent various fears is very clever. You play as this person's own courage, and the journey is one where you seek some sort of emotional breakthrough. These are all the makings of a good game, but unfortunately it's in some of the execution that Figment falters. The characters are fully voiced, and from the very first words that are muttered, it starts to feel like simple dialogue boxes might have worked better. The main character is very snarky, and he's got this little optimistic bird companion. There is no rule that a game about the human brain has to be dead serious, and I can certainly understand what they were going for with this quirkiness, but none of it really lands. The humor falls flat most of the time, and the performances aren't the best. I could easily be wrong, obviously, but it feels like each actor delivered their lines without any sort of direction or even context. Their inflections come out wrong, confusing what they're trying to say and creating an uncomfortable sort of performative dissonance. For example, one character says, "Nothing ever changes," to which another character replies, "That's not true, you did." This was clearly supposed to be, "You did," but it sounds like the line was read without any idea of the line that came before it. These kinds of oddities are sprinkled throughout the entire game. A friend was in the room while I was playing it, and we kept sharing these weird looks whenever a character would say something strangely. As for the gameplay, it really does function a lot like a traditional adventure game. You move around freely, and there are a multitude of puzzles to solve and items to collect and use in order to progress. These kinds of sequences are actually where Figment flourishes. There are several clever mechanics on display, and the game strikes that very tricky balance, where the puzzles are just the right amount of challenging without being overly tedious or intimidating. I love puzzles, but there's nothing worse than getting that puzzle fatigue when looking at another giant complicated puzzle and a long line of giant complicated puzzles and just not wanting to bother. Figment, however, nails the pacing for the most part. Where the game falters once more, however, is in combat. Enemies will occasionally pop up and you've got to take them out with your sword. This never feels particularly fun or conducive to the overall experience. Indeed, it feels kinda like it was tacked on just for the sake of doing it. Boss battles are a little better because there are puzzling elements in addition to the combat, but overall the act of hitting enemies with a sword just doesn't seem necessary. Like I said before, the game feels like it wants to be a traditional point-and-click adventure, and that other stuff just kinda gets in the way. I mean, the combat isn't terrible or anything, and it does give you something else to do, but when I imagine an identical game but with the combat completely removed, I can't say that it feels like a worse experience. And when an element of a game could be so easily thrown away, you know it isn't quite working. Going into Figment, I was really hoping for one of those quirky little indie gems that end up sticking with me for a long time. Something about the art and the style, it just felt like it had a whole lot going for it. But unfortunately, the overall experience didn't quite work for me. It's definitely not a bad game, and I can't even say that I regret playing it. Between the beautiful art and the great puzzles, it was certainly worth experiencing, and I'll admit there's a fine chance that you will feel all its elements fit together much better for you. For me though, in the end, it was a little disappointing. Annodyne is something of a difficult game for me to review. It works for me in ways that very few other games have, offering one of the most memorable gaming experiences I've had in recent memory. But it also has elements that I find a little off-putting, and it's the only game on the list today that I've yet to finish. There is a very specific mood achieved by some old games that I absolutely adore. It's this kind of darkish surrealism that you find primarily in old RPGs on the Super NES. It's a very particular blend of pixel graphics and simple yet evocative art and eerie music. Even games that do achieve this mood often do so only in little bits here and there, or they have other elements that compromise that mood. Because very few real things in life match these vague feelings we have in our minds. I've spent a lot of time imagining games that fit some exact tone or another, but finding those games rarely happens. And for many years now, I've been dreaming of playing some imaginary game that replicates the feeling of being a kid and sitting down in front of some weird RPG you've never played before, and having no idea what you might find in this weird, eerie fairy tale world. Well, I've finally found it. Annodyne is that game. It captures the aesthetic I've been talking about perfectly. It's dark and eerie and strange. The story is kind of vague in a dreamlike sort of way. There's a very heavy emphasis on exploration. Very often you're just pressing into new territories and having no idea what you're about to find. If you know me, you know that this is one of my very favorite things in games. A great sense of mystery and exploration means a whole lot to me. And even beyond just the visuals and the mystery, the game takes the surrealism thing to the exact lengths I've always hoped for. It's got all these little moments that leave your mouth hanging open, some sights that are just plain terrifying, or at the very least leave you feeling kind of confused and weirded out. And all of this with simple pixel graphics. I know the concept of mature themes showing up in media that doesn't otherwise look mature is an old thing by this point, but I must say that in cases like this, I still find it very effective. My experience with Annodyne has been positively magical thus far, and yet, as I said before, I just haven't mustered up the motivation to complete it. Not much of this can really count as actual criticism, I think. It seems to be some sort of purely personal issue that I'm actually having a hard time understanding myself. Normally, I feel that the more content a game has, the better. On paper, the idea of wrapping this whole experience up in a Zelda-like adventure is a terrific one. I mean, gosh, that sounds like a recipe for the best game of all time. Annodyne features a series of progressively more complex dungeons with lots of monsters to fight and puzzles to solve. And yet, for some reason, like I said, I really don't understand this myself, this gamey stuff only feels like it gets in the way. It's like I was so engrossed in the world and the exploration and the overall concept that when I started to hit this legitimate Zelda stuff, it almost felt out of place. And it would be one thing if this stuff really was just there to supplement and keep things interesting, but the further you progress, the more this stuff takes over the game. The puzzles and dungeons get more and more complicated, the bosses get harder and harder. I finished up with a large dungeon feeling a little exhausted by it. Then I looked online and found that the next dungeon was going to be even bigger and more complicated, and that each additional dungeon would only become more so. I continued to play the game, and in fact, I reached an area that might have been the coolest one in the game so far, but when I hit the door to the next dungeon, I just kinda stopped. Even now, there's this urge to finish the game and see all the other cool stuff it might throw at me. But honestly, I don't think that's gonna happen. Something about the prospect is just too intimidating. I love Zelda dungeons. I love tricky puzzles. And yet somehow here, it just doesn't work for me. I'm so eager to experience all the cool surrealism that the idea of having to press through another huge dungeon is too much. Like I said, much of this seems to be a weird personal problem I have with the game, but I do have at least one solid reason. At one point in the game, you gain the ability to jump. After this, there are many platforming sequences, and as with most, if not all, classic top-down games that involve jumping, like the Zelda games that inspired this one in fact, this platforming doesn't feel particularly good. After struggling through many of these sequences, the thought of having to get through even more of them in the game's remaining dungeons adds considerably to the intimidation. Will I ever finish Annodyne? At this point, it's very doubtful. The further I get from the game, the less likely I am to pick it up again. I'm not even gonna remember where I am or what I was doing or what I should be doing after I complete the dungeon. But even if I don't though, I can very much appreciate it for what it did offer me. And if tricky dungeons don't ever get you down, and you also enjoy that weird old RPG mood, Annodyne is a no-brainer. It is clearly a very, very high quality game. In fact, I got the game on sale for $1, so for that price, even someone who doesn't particularly like big dungeons at all might as well give it a try. Even just the opening hour or so is worth the price of admission alone. Well, that's it. Another 5 eShop games have been mini-reviewed. Have you played any of these games? Did you love them? Did you hate them? Have you not played them, but now you're gonna play them? Let me know down in those comments down there, and while you're at it, let me know what other eShop games you'd like to see me review. As long as it's not Hollow Knight or Celeste. Because I know you want that. Although actually, I just got Celeste like a couple weeks ago. I got it on sale. So yeah, maybe I'll do Celeste. Probably not though. I think at this point it'd be funnier just not to like ever do it. Like specifically Hollow Knight and Celeste. Just never ever touch them. Never in a million years. That's funny, right? I get comedy. That's comedy, right?